Right. No, probably not. But we're speaking with two individuals on the subject of climate change. I have in the studio with me Dr. Tom Johnson from the University of Missouri. He's with the Department of Agricultural Economics and the Truman School of Public Affairs. Also on the phone, speaking to us from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, Tennessee, is Mr. Trevor Hedberg, who is taking his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Tennessee and will be speaking to us about ethical concerns on climate change. I suppose one thing when we're talking about climate change, we should know what are the biggest challenges that we as a populace face as a result of climate change. And we'll go first to Dr. Tom Johnson.
Thanks, Daria. Climate change, the biggest challenge, I suppose, is the rate of change in everything around us, a rate of change that we're not familiar with. As a society, we learn how our environment works. We expect it to be variable, but constant in its mean. What happens with climate change is the knowledge that we have gained over the generations and centuries starts to be less valuable because of the rate of change. Nature, similarly, is challenged by this rate of change. Species are always evolving to meet changing contexts and circumstances, but when the rate of change is accelerated, it means that the evolutionary process that many species face is simply too slow to accommodate. As a result, there's an increased rate of species loss, extinctions, and maladaptations to the environment, and so the ecosystem gets out of sync, and possibly society also becomes out of sync. So I think, in a broad sense, that's the biggest challenge: is how to adapt to this rapidly changing set of circumstances.
Yes, and Trevor, how do you see the challenge of this fast-moving climate change that we're experiencing?
So Tom highlighted one particularly poignant aspect of climate change that's really problematic, which is an extremely fast rate of change, both with respect to nature and with respect to human society. In my case, I don't think that I would identify one particular dimension of climate change as being, obviously to me at least, the biggest problem, but there are a couple that I can think of that seem really problematic. One of them, given my background in ethics, has to do with the way our moral thinking has been shaped over time. If you look at the history of ethics, the vast majority up until the mid-20th century was focused almost exclusively on interactions between presently existing human individuals. And that was it was taken to be almost the entirety of the scope of moral concern. Is just how we should interact with other human beings in the context of society. And then when you get towards middle of the 20th century, all of a sudden new considerations start to come into the foray. So considerations about the welfare of non-human animals, considerations about how we might affect nature and ecosystems or cause species extinctions, and also how we might affect not yet existing people who will exist in the future. If you go back in time 200, 300 years, we didn't really have the power to have that sort of intergenerational reach with what we do. But now we certainly do, based on what our population numbers look like, or how many resources we consume or deplete, and a variety of other factors. We can make future people far worse off than they otherwise would have been, and that's a power that we just didn't have 200 or 300 years ago. And so one of the biggest challenges in the moral domain is figuring out how we can modify our previously existing understanding of ethics to accommodate this new intergenerational dimension, and also how we can accommodate it to bring into the moral realm considerations that are non-anthropocentric, or in other words, not human-centered or not human-exclusive. And that's, I think, a huge sort of theoretical challenge that's raised by climate change. There are also a number of practical problems. One of them has to do with just the fact that climate change is a genuine global problem, and that the way that our global infrastructure is set up, we have all these independently existing countries that don't really answer to any kind of world government. But since climate change is a global problem, you're going to have some kind of genuinely international solution to really cut down on the emission of greenhouse gases, or make the necessary adaptation to the warmer world. And that can't be done at a local or regional level. It really has to be done internationally. And our political institutions are just not set up naturally to make that work. And so that's been, I think, the source of the majority, though not all, but the majority of the large-scale political problems we've had, and the difficulties in reaching, with all these different climate change conventions, the difficulty in reaching any kind of workable agreement on the topic. Now, as far as your question about what about us for the United people in the United States, well, if you look at it at the individual level, the real problem, I think, is one of motivation, because our lives, at least in the United States, as people who grow up and live in a developed part of the world, we're just really insulated from the real significant problems of climate change. And the technologies that have given rise to the climate change problem are such pervasive features of our lives, things that in many respects we can't really imagine living without. Many of my undergraduate students who are 18 to 20 years old, they have lived their entire life with things like the internet and cellular phones and video games and all these other advanced technologies that 50, 60 years ago we just didn't have. And if we did have them, they were in a much smaller supply. So it's culturally, at least in the developed world and in particular in the United States, I think we just face a serious challenge of getting people to take the necessary steps to separate themselves from these technologies and be willing to make some sacrifices so that we can, in the long run, reduce our global carbon footprint and avoid some of the most catastrophic effects of climate change.
Very interesting points, Trevor. And from an economist's point of view, some complementary perspectives on what you've mentioned. The intertemporal decision-making, economists typically use a discounting process or procedure to weight the results, both costs and benefits in the future relative to the costs and benefits and investments made in the present. The problem with that approach, of course, is that it is done without information about what the future generations will want, what future generations will face in terms of challenges, and it's primarily done in absence of information about the rate of change that we're talking about. It's very difficult to incorporate certain kinds of risk factors into those calculations, and so like your perspective, the economist's perspective is that we find our tools somewhat lacking when we are faced with climate change and other very game-changing kinds of shifts in our environment. Your point about the global reach of this problem, again, a very complementary view from the economics perspective is that we rely on processes, markets, and political processes when the costs and the consequences of the decisions we make occur locally. When they are global, as climate change certainly is, the carbon that is produced in Tennessee or Missouri is a part of the global carbon. When those things occur, many of the mechanisms, the institutions we rely on simply don't work anymore. We get this global scaled free rider problem where when certain countries, some cities in some cases, go out of their way to reduce carbon, it benefits other people, other parts of the world equally. In fact, there's on a local scale, the benefits are minuscule relative to the scale, the benefits globally. And so we don't find the incentives to do that. So we get this global scaled free rider problem where there's really no or little incentive for regions or even countries to make the changes that will bring about a better global environment. So that indicates that different institutions, and they have to be globally focused and oriented, certainly, but they have to find ways to create incentives, either negative or positive, for people to get involved in solving the problems. And finally, your point about distribution, again, is very, very critical. And economists understand the global distributional consequences of what's happening. We know that much of the energy in the world is consumed by just a few developed parts of the world, Europe and North America, and a few other places. And we also know that carbon emissions are very closely related to energy consumption, which is very closely related to growth in our prosperity. So we're faced with the dilemma that if we strive for greater development around the world, we have to understand that one of the costs of that will be greater levels of carbon emissions. So, and we can't simply say, I mean, ethically, it's a challenge to say, well, we're going to eliminate the opportunities for development in the less developed parts of the world in order to improve the global climate. And finally, on that issue, I would point out that we really need to distinguish between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Mitigation is trying to slow or reverse, and obviously there are huge benefits to reducing the rate at which climate changes. But it's too late to solve that completely. No matter what we do, we have to start adapting. And then the distributional issue comes to the fore again. Who is most likely to have the resources to adapt to these changes? And it's going to be the developing nations, whereas the less developed and developing world is on the margin. They are the most influenced by climate change in many ways because they're so close to the margin all the time, and yet they have the least resources to adapt. So there's this huge need for a global perspective on distributional issues, on distribution of benefits, distribution of investments, distribution of the hardships and the benefits of change.
Trevor, this certainly gets into some of your thesis on the compensation-based approach to climate change, does it not?
I'll weave that in, but I want to follow up on 2 points that Tom made that I think are really important and worth stressing, and then I'll tie that into what I wrote my master's thesis about. The first is, Tom, you've essentially reiterated one of there's not a consensus about everything with respect to climate change as far as what we should ethically do, but there is a pretty significant majority of the literature would say that the folks who should bear the burdens of mitigation and adaptation are going to be the developed nations. And it's largely because of the considerations that you mentioned. If we look at it historically, it's the developed nations that have contributed the most to the problem. If we look at it right now, it's still, for the most part, the developed nations that are contributing the most to the problem. China is rapidly increasing its carbon emissions, so they're maybe the notable exception in that regard, and they've actually just recently overtaken the United States in terms of total national CO2 emissions, although their per capita is still much, much lower than a lot of developing countries because China has such a huge population. But there's those two factors, historical emissions and present emissions, just the amount. There's also the fact that the nations that are going to suffer the most as a result of the effects of climate change are, by and large, going to be developing nations. So those two factors, the contributors have been the developed nations. They're the ones that have benefited the most from emitting the extra CO2 and being able to develop their resources and economies and so on. The developing nations, in contrast, not only haven't had those benefits, but are also going to be the most adversely affected by things like sea level rise and the increased range of diseases as a result of species getting displaced and insect carriers of, things like malaria expanding their range further from the equator, as well as increased droughts and other severe weather events. And unfortunately, those developing nations also have fewer resources to adapt to these various problems. So there's a constellation of different concerns that seem to all lead to roughly the same conclusion, namely that if anybody's going to bear the majority of the costs of mitigation and adaptation, it's going to, for the most part, have to be the developed nations like those in Western Europe and the United States and Canada and Australia and so on. The other point you mentioned that I'm glad you brought up was the social discount rate. That is a principle that has been significantly criticized in the philosophical literature because for mainly two reasons. One, just being that the percentage rate at which the social discount is established, to my memory, I think that if I want to say, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, I want to say that 5% was sort of the standard figure. Some folks just think that the way that number is generated is completely arbitrary and indefensible for that reason. Other folks have said that the social discount rate unfairly seems to value the welfare of future people as being less than the welfare of presently existing people. But those folks will make an argument that the time in which you exist surely has no significant bearing on your moral status or the value of your welfare or anything like that. And so it doesn't, from just a standpoint of, the moral significance of future people relative to the moral significance of presently existing people, it just doesn't make sense to discount the future in that particular way. The welfare of future people should be taken as equivalent in value to the welfare of presently existing people. Now there are various ways that some folks tried to push back against that view. There are worries that this might make you, hostage to, that might make the present generation in some sense hostage to the interests of future people. But I don't want to get into those particular issues. The point that Darius alluded to has to do with a master's thesis I wrote last semester. Tom made the useful distinction between mitigating climate change, reducing its impact, or potentially even reversing it or reversing its effects or its rate, and adapting to climate change, which simply means taking the vulnerable populations and making them better able to cope with the warmer world or the other significant climate impacts that they'll face, whether those be droughts, severe weather events, sea level rise, and so on. So adaptation might include things like building seawalls or helping people develop heat-resistant crops or giving them other forms of aid as the effects of climate change become more significant. But my thesis was interested in a third approach to the issue, which I have a feeling will become more relevant as time goes on, not discussed. It's discussed some in the literature, but not nearly as much as I think it should be. And that approach is based on compensating people who are or will become victims of climate change. So we commonly think in our ordinary moral reasoning that one way we go about rectifying bad things that we do is by compensating victims in some way for the bad things that we do to them. And my thesis was essentially kind of an attempt to think about what sorts of goods could we give to future people that could serve as adequate compensation for the harms of climate change. And when climate change compensation has been discussed in the literature, the dominant approach is monetary compensation. So in some cases, people have proposed a fund of some sort be developed that's kind of like a common resource. And so individuals who are from nations that are victims of climate change can apply for some kind of, remedial aid of sorts in that way. For the most part, what I've seen, these things are just theoretical proposals. I'm not aware of any concrete policy in which this has been actualized in any way. But my own interest in the issue was, could there be non-monetary goods that we might be able to pass on to future people? And in particular, I wanted to focus on certain knowledge-related goods, or epistemic goods, as we call them in the philosophical literature. Could there be things that we could give future people, bits of knowledge and information that might be extremely helpful or beneficial to them in the future? And I'm going on a bit too long, so I'll just list one example of this. There's an ongoing debate in the climate change discussion about whether or not we should seriously pursue geoengineering research and to what extent. And it strikes me that if we were to learn some things about the potential effectiveness, the risks and so on of geoengineering, that could potentially be a piece of knowledge that we could work toward acquiring now, that if we could give to future people in, say, 2050 or 2100, when they might actually be in a position where they're seriously thinking about undertaking, geoengineering the atmosphere to try to reverse or mitigate the effects of climate change, that seems like that would be really valuable information for them to have. Not saying, this isn't by way of saying that they should, in fact, geoengineer the atmosphere. We'd need to know a lot more about their circumstances. But the idea is they would be able to make an informed decision based on the research that we could have started and undertaken now and over the next 20 or 30 years.
Very interesting, Trevor. I would argue that the three strategies, mitigation, adaptation, and compensation, are not alternatives, but rather complements. I think we need to do all of those. And in fact, the idea of compensation has a number of additional benefits. If compensation was required for behavior at the national level, international compensation, it would create greater incentives for national and regional and local governments to behave in a globally conscious way. So I think that compensation of any kind would certainly lead to a better outcome in the end. As far as the idea of compensating with knowledge, I think I would argue that is something that is a part of our culture and has been. It's just a matter of being more cognizant of what kind of knowledge we are transferring or providing to the future. Any knowledge that we gain in the present is available for the future. In a world of rapidly changing climate in which our species are threatened and various species are threatened or challenged, where our food supply is challenged, and many other, our societal institutions are threatened, we need today to think about knowledge that will prepare the future better. And I think that's very consistent with your thesis, that the most valuable knowledge that we could pass forward would be ways to deal with the problems. And, the adaptation is and should be more than just building seawalls and things like that. It should be thinking about ways that we can reduce the number of extinctions. It should be ways that we understand how climate change is likely to affect our food supply, and find ways to if we're always adapting our plants and animals for some purpose. If we were more deliberate about doing research that would make them resilient and improve their survivability and yields and so on in climate, in a different climate, we would be farther ahead, and we'd be providing the future with much more valuable knowledge. I don't know what you think about that, but my view is that we are always providing a greater array of knowledge for the future. It's just being very deliberate about what kind of knowledge we provide them.
Yeah. So as far as what I think about what you've just said, pretty straightforward. I don't think I disagree with anything that you just said. So I completely agree that an adequate global response to climate change involve some integration of all three of those different approaches, some form of significant mitigation, appropriate measures taken with respect to adaptation, and for those whom are still, despite those measures taken, harmed by climate change, measures of compensation taken to help them out. The reason why I'm particularly interested in compensation is that it just looks like whatever we should do with respect to mitigation and adaptation, we're probably not going to do, at least not to the extent that we really genuinely should. In the literature, a lot of folks have talked about trying the generally acceptable global goal as being a 2-degree stabilizing greenhouse gas emission levels such that we maintain a 2 degrees Celsius rise or less from pre-industrial levels. And at least based on the projections I've seen and the rate at which greenhouse gas emissions are still globally increasing, I'm very pessimistic that we're going to meet that threshold, that we're going to stabilize the climate at the 2 degrees.
I agree, Trevor. It's just not possible at the way we're going. I agree with you entirely.
And I think that's probably true, even if some miracle were to happen tomorrow and there's a treaty signed. Just because of the effects of climate change are delayed. So it's not like the second that extra carbon molecule gets in the atmosphere, the temperature goes up some small degree. There's a significant delay over when the temperature effects are actually observable and start to produce these widespread environmental impacts. And it just seems like we're already within the next maybe we would have until like 2020, but it just seems like I've seen some people make this claim, but at most I feel like we have unless we were to stabilize carbon levels in the next 5 to 7 years, and then start radically reducing maybe at a rate of 2% globally per year or something like that. Unless there's some kind of miracle solution like that on the horizon, that 2 degrees Celsius is just not going to happen. And given the way that the global infrastructure is, there are good grounds here for pessimism about those kinds of projections. And so if we're not going to be able to do everything that we morally ought to do with respect to adaptation mitigation, then what we should do with respect to compensation seems to loom a little bit larger in the conversation. But you do make a great point, though, that if there were compensatory mechanisms in place, and if say the developed nations were the ones who had to bear those responsibilities of compensation, that would be my own view, and that would be consistent, I think, with the consensus that the duties of mitigation and adaptation should primarily be borne by the developed nations. Then all of a sudden, those developed nations have some incentive to actually reduce their carbon footprints and take actions to try to develop more sustainable sources of energy, and also to help the populations adapt so that they're not adversely affected by severe weather events and other things, so that the developed nations then won't have to pay out compensation to them. There would be that would all be good things. The main problem is, what enforcement mechanism could we create? What international enforcement mechanism could there be to actually hold all of those nations accountable in the right ways with this compensatory scheme? And that's the major practical hurdle I would see to that.
That is
to
right.
that proposal.
Yeah, there needs to be stronger international institutions, and at the same time that there's so much resistance to even the international institutions that we have today. It's a formidable socio-political challenge. I agree.
Yeah, and so one thing that interested me is, you brought up considerations about animal welfare and considerations about species extinctions. The reason I say that interested me is that, the reason it interested me in particular is because most of the economic approaches to climate change, at least as they're represented in the literature, are usually decidedly human-centered. And so it's interesting that you as essentially an economist would bring up those considerations and identify them as being really, really important. I don't have a ton of friends who are economists, and I'm not familiar with that many people who are environmental economists, but at least as I've seen the views expressed in the literature, a lot of economists tend to minimize those kinds of considerations. So I'd be curious if there's a reason why you emphasize their importance.
Well, admittedly, I'm coming at this from a human perspective, but I take a very broad view of what is in human interest, and the survival of species, diversity of our ecology, all of these things have huge current and even larger benefits. Daria and I were talking before about some other issues, and my colleagues and I have been working on the area of wealth as an indicator of performance, economic performance. We have a book coming out soon on the topic, and the idea is that we need, instead of a flow measure like gross domestic product, which really doesn't get at the fundamentals in so many ways of our quality of life, we need to think about wealth. And wealth includes the natural wealth that we enjoy, the social capital and social wealth that we enjoy, all of the cultural wealth that we enjoy. And if you broaden your perspective to include these other forms of wealth as a foundation for the quality of life on the earth, you have no choice but to consider things that are outside the markets. You have to think of the ecology, the species survivability, the diversity of cultural and environmental experiences. So, I think it's still human-centric, but it is much broader and more comprehensive in its inclusion.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. So you're trying to basically broaden the notion of wealth so that it doesn't just encompass monetary figures, but in fact includes a plurality of goods.
Absolutely, yeah, and
beyond that.
And work by others, us and others, demonstrates that the traditional measures of wealth are probably a small fraction of the total wealth when you consider. And this goes back to your idea of compensating with knowledge. Our accumulated knowledge, human capital, and intellectual capital is probably dwarfs many of the other kinds of capital that we traditionally measure the financial kinds of capital, the total value of knowledge and human capital and skills and health. Those things dwarf the traditional measures.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Of course, I should mention that my emphasis on knowledge-related goods for the context of the thesis. I certainly don't think that that's the only form of compensation that would be appropriate. I think that the kind of compensation that will be appropriate is going to vary extremely radically depending on the circumstances of the people whom we are compensating. So if you're, on an island nation like Kiribati, and 50 years from now your island nation gets completely engulfed in the sea, and you have to be reintegrated into a polity or something, it would seem very odd if someone just gives you a copy of Plato's Republic and said, here's some knowledge, be on your way. That would be totally absurd. The folks in those kinds of situations are going to need some kind of really robust compensation beyond just that. Of course, the ideal form of compensation for those folks would probably be something like finding some kind of territory that could be ceded from some existing nation so that they could just keep their country. But for various political reasons, I doubt that form of compensation will be on the table when those situations arise. But the circumstances of the folks who we are compensating would be extremely important. I do think, though, that your point about the value of, as you called it, knowledge capital is exactly right. I think that it's hugely important, and this is actually one of the things that I see as advantageous to focusing on knowledge-based compensation, is that this seems like something that, at least with respect to a lot of things, we can reasonably expect that virtually any future people will see significant value in the knowledge that we pass on. And of course, some of it's really obvious. Some of it would be, knowledge that has instrumental value to them. So my case of knowledge about geoengineering research would be one obvious example of that. And it would be very pertinent instrumental value because it might actually help them generate some kind of informed solution to the climate change problem. Or of course it could also indicate to them no, risks of geoengineering are way too bad, we really shouldn't pursue that. Either way, they would know what their options were. But even in cases where the instrumental value isn't as concrete or obvious, so if it's just passing on important scholarship about human history, there's still a lot of evidence based on human history and what we value that there are still going to be lots of folks who think that stuff's really important and that it's sort of worth valuing for its own sake, even if it doesn't have any serious instrumental benefits or obvious practical benefits.
Trevor, I'm not sure if I will lead the conversation in other directions, but as a layman in this topic, I'm wondering, you're talking about how reticent the world population is, and especially our leaders and our institutions, to a certain amount of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. How resistant will they be also to compensation? When the world is collapsing, I don't think that we have others in our sights.
I haven't thought about I haven't thought about the motivation problem as it pertains particularly to compensation. My sort of intuition about it would be I wouldn't see it as I wouldn't see there being any more or less resistance compensating people for climate change than there would be to mitigating or adapting for climate change. These things all seem to be, in some sense, kind of interwoven together. I mean, they all involve, responding to climate change in morally appropriate ways. And I would think that it would be the sort of thing that for most people, you either think, we really have an obligation here to work out a global agreement and put the different mechanisms in place to hold nations accountable, and this is going to involve some degree of mitigation, adaptation, and compensation. Or your view is something like, well, look, there are just no benefits for us as an individual nation to engage in any of these measures with respect to climate change, and so we're not going to do it. And unfortunately, At present, I worry that the second view is a little bit more dominant. That's not to say that there aren't many nations that might be willing collaborators in the event that other people were also, willing to collaborate. But at present, a lot of folks seem to have the attitude that, I'm not going to sacrifice my national interests for just to essentially be a martyr while everyone else just continues to emit greenhouse gas emissions, because that's going to slow down our economic growth and our development. And it's not, unless other people all act in the same way that we are, there aren't going to be any benefits. We're not actually going to solve the climate change problem anyway. So I don't see any. I guess the short version is the situation looks bad, and it looks just as bad for a compensation-oriented approach as it does for a mitigation or adaptation-oriented one.
I agree with you entirely, Trevor. I think my take on how to make any of these strategies work. One way would be for countries to give up some sovereignty, which is not going to happen. And I say that they're not going to turn over certain rights to some global institution, to something created at a supranational level. What can be done, however, is to increase the understanding of the dire consequences of inaction, and they go beyond the obvious things like sea level rise and violent storms and so on. It's clear that those things come at a cost, and the cost broadly measured in terms of not only money but lives and cultural assets and mental health and things like that. But it risks global political instability as well, and things like that. If we could impress on the nations of the world and the people of the nations of the world how serious some of these consequences are, and to underscore the value to people of diverse environments and healthy species and so on, then we could create institutions that were more based on voluntary, but certainly incentivized behavior, and there would still be the incentive for small countries or certain countries without strong domestic institutions to ignore these things. But the nations of the world could create more incentives for them to come in line and do their part. And everybody has to do their part. It won't work unless we get a vast majority of the nations and the people of the world taking actions that will bring about a better environment.
But are we not becoming a globe of corporations rather than a globe of nations?
Well, yes. We have more nations than ever. It's certainly true, though, that we have more global corporations than ever. Global corporations have a different set of incentives. They deal with institutions and laws and opportunities in many different countries. But certainly a well-devised set of policies can, especially if it's global in nature, can lead to the kind of behavior, better behavior on the part of, not only of corporations but of nations and of individuals. So I don't see that as a as an obstacle, it's a challenge, but not an obstacle.
The thing about this that is in some ways most discouraging is you're absolutely right to emphasize that there are lots of effects of climate change that will go beyond just the examples I've been parroting out here the last few times. Those are the ones that are the most discussed. There will be serious concerns about just the changes in the global infrastructure that result from these things, as well as large-scale environmental changes, radical disruption to ecosystems, massive species extinctions. At least for unmitigated climate change, it'll be, we could be looking at, half the species on the planet half the known species on the planet at present being wiped out. If we really go as far as, 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels or something like that. And I've even seen a couple of recent publications where scientists have projected that if we burn all of the fossil fuels in existence, that we will actually make very large portions of the Earth uninhabitable. Near the equator, it'll just be too hot to genuinely survive. Now, I'm not in a position to evaluate whether that's totally accurate or not, but there are some really disastrous effects on the horizon, not in our lifetimes, but 2 or 3 generations hence. So, people who live in the year 2100 may seriously be facing these, I won't go so far as to say, apocalyptic scenarios, but the kind of stuff that we would typically think makes for a good, science fiction backdrop could be a reasonable reality in 2100 if things don't significantly change. If we just continue with business as usual and just continue to burn fossil fuels and put the stuff into the atmosphere. But the thing is, there's plenty of information about this stuff, and it's freely available. It's not like it's hidden behind paywalls or in some obscure corner of the internet. You can just read, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports, and if you just read that stuff and just process what it really means, it's terrifying. And despite that, and despite the prevalence of this information, we still face all of these obstacles to working out a solution. I think that's the part that probably bothers me the most about the whole the current trajectory of climate change policy and international negotiations about the issue.
That is true, Trevor. I fear that the mainstream population is not really informed about the real disasters that probably face us. We're 80% here in America, we're about 80% urban now as far as our populations. So that means our large expanse of rural territories which have to provide fresh water, which have to provide the food and all of the main ingredients for sustaining life to us, they're left unattended to. And the corporations, however, are out there and they're mining the aquifers, they're mining the land and the soil.
Trevor, did you want to respond to that?
Feel free to ignore it also and go to
Daria's point, I think, is a very important one. Even in this country, 95% of the land area is still rural by most standards, and so. People have actually measured the amount of water that falls, rainfall, and how much water resources are in rural areas versus urban areas, and it's vast. Most of the building blocks for our economy and our society originate in rural areas, and in some cases, they can be better protected if there are fewer people there. That's true. But on the other hand, our vulnerability rises as we become more concentrated in cities. We become more dependent on the supply chains and the ability to move the food and the energy. That the sunshine still falls equally, almost equally, on urban and rural areas, which means that most of it is falling on rural areas, and that means that our ultimately our food and our energy and our water and all those sort of things have to come from rural areas, and the ability to procure, to protect, to prepare, and to transport that to the population centers depends on infrastructure and an adequate knowledge and an adequate workforce and skills and so on in those rural areas. So I become concerned when I see policies that are based on the assumption that our future depends only on the success of our urban areas, because I think the urban areas, their success depends on rural areas. So, and we have to be very concerned about the exploitation of the resources in rural areas. The exploitation of one resource can be very detrimental to the others, and so if we destroy our forests or agricultural land in order to get more and more energy, we're not ahead.
Yeah, and the supply chains in which you speak are in some ways intricately bound up, as are most elements of our current technological and economic infrastructure, with a lot of these climate change oriented problems. Even though it's not obvious exactly how, but the main way is that, frankly, it just uses a lot of energy to transport all those goods, and it also and to transport, if we're talking about, like, say, animal farming, to transport the resources that are necessary to feed the animals that are kept in industrialized farming operations, and keep those animals alive long enough so that they can be slaughtered and then transport them all across the country. And the same thing happens to a lesser extent with vegetables and fruits and non-animal edibles, so to speak. But it's not as pronounced. The process isn't as environmentally destructive, doesn't involve as much consumption of resources. But this is sort of for the individual consumer, this is why it's, from an environmental perspective, it's always better to buy locally as opposed to getting stuff that's been imported, because if you're buying things that are imported, you're supporting that economic mechanism which perpetuates this cycle. Unfortunately, there are also issues that your individual refraining from those kinds of purchases probably won't have a huge market impact by itself. It would have to be some kind of large-scale collective effort by people, and that's really the only. And there's so much inertia against that kind of change because of the way that the system is set up. Mm-hmm. Just another layer to the dimension of the problems that we've been discussing.
Yes, I agree.
Trevor, you're talking about animal agriculture and talking about the large settlements called CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, that abound all throughout the Midwest and California, on the coast also. Do you consider these CAFOs and this factory farming of the animals, of another species, I might add also, of a species that we owe quite a bit of respect to, yet we are in deplorable ways handling these species. Do you consider this to be a drain on the resources? Could you give us a little bit of information about that, or your ideas on that?
So my main reason if I'm just thinking of myself as an individual consumer in the United States, my main reasons for not purchasing what I would call factory farmed meat, which in this context just means meat that come from the CAFOs, using the term you've introduced, would really be because I don't want to support a process of institutionalized animal suffering. So it doesn't, I'll admit that in my own deliberations, concerns about climate change, which I certainly have, actually don't enter in the same kind of way. Now, oddly enough, I actually know several people who are vegetarians for that reason, for the reason that they actually think that it is climate change that motivates them. So they actually don't have the concerns about animal suffering as their primary moral reason. They really do think that it's really because of the way in which those institutions are not environmentally sustainable. They consume too many resources. They contribute too significantly to a cluster of environmental problems independent of animal suffering. Now, personally, I don't really criticize them for that. As far as I'm concerned, those are just two really good moral reasons not to support the current industrialized agricultural practices. But at least for me as an individual, the consideration about climate change isn't the primary factor in making that decision. Now, if the question is what can I do as an individual to, in some sense, make a difference with respect to climate change, or like what contribution can I make to solving this problem of a global scope that I look just totally powerless to do anything about? You can look at it in one of two ways. You can either look at it as, if it's just strictly how can I make a difference, the best thing you can probably do is to try at whatever local or regional level you might be able to make a difference, try to exert some political pressure. So one of the most basic things you could do is don't vote for politicians that don't take climate change seriously, or that don't think that environmental concerns are a priority. If you're more of an activist, you could actually try to, rally a community to this sort of cause. But for a lot of people may not have the time or resources to be able to become an environmental activist. And so for those folks, I would say a more minimal, political commitment to just not rewarding politicians who don't care about the environment, possibly writing some letters to your local, your representatives and your representatives to Congress or your senators. That kind of stuff might, in the political realm, might be some of the best things you could do. But there's also a question of just, given the global nature of this problem, given its significance, how should I structure my life? Which is independent of, how can I make a difference to solving this problem? And at least for me, I routinely fail at this because the way that our network of institutions is set up, there are certain things that I really can't do. So ideally, any time that, you're consuming resources or using electricity and things like that, there's a sense in which you're caught up in a causal chain that's pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So in theory, the best thing to do is just totally unplug yourself from the system, from just go totally off the grid, or, I guess install a solar power plant to power your home or something crazy like that. But I don't have those kinds of resources or the ability to live in that sort of way, and I don't think very many people do. So what you have to do is try to find some kind of a balance and try to limit yourself to doing the things that have as little environmental impact as possible, but are still consistent, but still, I guess the way to put it is you have to permit yourself to have some resource consumption in this context. You just can't really live otherwise. But I admit that, finding the proper balance and figuring out exactly, what I can reasonably cut back on and what I can't is a really difficult process, and not something that I have found the answer to. But my reason for doing that isn't that I think that my individual emissions make, that my reductions make a difference to solving the problem. It's more that, given what I know about climate change and given that I think it's a really, really big global problem, I think that I should do as much as I can not to be a just, unwitting contributor to the problem. I should structure my life in such a way to try to reduce my individual contribution. It's sort of, it's part of maintaining my integrity as a person, being consistent with the values that I that I espouse with respect to the environment.
And that's really beautiful, giving credence to one's ethical thoughts and then enacting that in your life. I'd like to bring in the idea of overpopulation. It's sort of a taboo subject, but certainly overpopulation is a factor in climate change.
Yes, I think population is fundamentally fundamental to this problem. I mean that if we had a smaller population, we would be able to live closer to the sustainable levels of consumption of all kinds. The problem is the only certain way that we've ever discovered to reduce population growth is through development. Other than famine and things like that, but war and famine. But the only way to reduce the rate of natural childbirth is to increase the development and the prosperity of people. And that, of course, has the unintended consequence of increasing consumption as well. So we need to, I think, find ways to we can't solve the problems without development, and we then have to understand that makes certain other parts of the problem more difficult, more challenging. But absolutely, if we can't reduce the growth in population, we have very little chance because the world has a certain carrying capacity. Technology helps, but it has side effects as well that we have become painfully aware of over the generations.
Yeah, so I've sometimes wondered in my own free time what the world would be like if it just had 1 billion people. We currently have more than 7 billion, so that would be a much lower population. And the reason I wonder about this sometimes is because if you had only 1/7 of the current population, even if everyone was, emitting plenty of greenhouse gases, like if everyone had the emission levels of a standard developed nation in Western Europe, say, or something like that, I still suspect that we wouldn't have the problem. The scope of the problem would still, despite the fact that would, for many nations, that would be an increase from their current levels of emission. We wouldn't have the same kind of problem because the quantity of greenhouse gases being emitted just wouldn't be enough to bring about this extremely rapid climate change that we're looking at. And there would be a number of other, things that would environmental benefits that would come about as well. One of them is we wouldn't have to have so many animals that we would have to harvest to feed so many people. And we just generally wouldn't have to consume nearly as many resources. Now, it's there, unless we were going to do some pretty crazy and grossly unethical, like manufacture a chemical weapon or some kind of new disease or something like that, and then deploy it on very large areas of the population, or implement some kind of crazed social policy like what we found in the science fiction film Logan's Run, where everyone has to die at the age of 30. It's unlikely that we're going to get any kind of radical population reduction of that sort. So, that gets us into the practical question of, well, how the hell, given the current increase and given the fact that we're looking at 9 billion people, by 2050, how are we going to bring the population down? And historically, as Thomas pointed out, if we look at it, it just seems like development is a crucial factor in being able to get people to, for various reasons, to feel socially, economically, et cetera, secure enough to where they won't reproduce as much. And there are some other issues that are involved. Things like access to contraceptives and giving women equal rights and things like that. Those are also contributing factors. But overpopulation in many respects is kind of an elephant in the room style problem. Everybody knows it's a problem, but very, very few people really, have, at least I'm mainly speaking about the philosophical literature here, very few people want to say, for instance, that there's like a moral obligation, to have like 2 kids or less, for example. Like that there would be something morally wrong with having more than 2 children. And it's understandable why people want to be permissive with respect to reproductive rights. But I think that in the near future, that's an applied moral issue that's going to need a lot more attention. Is what are our reproductive obligations, given that our children are going to consume lots and lots of resources, and that their consumption of resources, especially if you're in a developed country, is going to be radically disproportionate to how many resources they would consume if they were in, say, India or Bangladesh or some other country like that. It's a huge issue, and I certainly can't even gesture at a tentative solution to the problem, here, but it is something that deserves an awful lot of attention. And ideally, we're going to have to come up with some other way to reduce population beyond just developing the entire world, because if we do that, then we're going to bring about a whole host of other environmental problems to solve, to help contribute to solving the problem of overpopulation. That does not look like an ideal solution in any sense. But that just raises a question of, okay, well, so what do we do? I don't have a good answer.
No, and there's a huge global distributional issue because the vast majority of the population growth is in the least developed parts of the world. And for us in North America to talk about the need for moral solutions, and rather than or institutional solutions as opposed to development. How do we do that morally, ethically? Tell people in Africa or prevent people from Africa from having large families when it's part of their culture. I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's an elephant in the room style problem. Seems like a huge practical problem that needs to be taken seriously and addressed, but it is certainly not one that yields any intuitive solution at all. In fact, most of the solutions that come to mind look like they would be just patently unjust and coercive. Like we would be imposing, our cultural values or our moral high ground, so to speak, on people who are in just like the worst, in some cases, the worst possible, economic and social circumstances. That just doesn't seem to show proper respect for the situations in which those people find themselves. I don't know. That's another. I'm not optimistic that there's any solution to overpopulation coming in the near future.
So we will. Well, I don't know. You talked about science fiction, Trevor. In science fiction, often nowadays we have complete scenarios that are talking about a handful of humans left with just a fragment of the world, and so perhaps we are meandering towards sort of self-annihilation, and there will be no nations or groups, etc., that are large enough, and we reform, etc. But who knows? But what talking about climate change, for the our listening audience, we're here at KOPN Columbia, Missouri. For our listening audience, perhaps you could each one of you, Tom and Trevor, give us a succinct definition of climate change, and also perhaps an idea of what, you were saying the individual could, talk to their representatives, their political groups, etc. But what information is out there that we can really start to become our own mentors as far as understanding what climate change is, how long we actually have. We hear about this tipping point that we've already perhaps gone beyond. Is there something that the normal person can do in order to start taking a part in the climate change factor?
Well, I'm perhaps not the best person to define climate change, certainly in a climatological or meteorological sense. But to me, the climate is variable. It changes. It changes over millennia and longer periods of time. What we mean by climate change in the current discussions is rapid and single direction change in certain phenomena, including the temperature is perhaps one of the less important issues. It's the change in the variability in precipitation and storm systems and all of the things that affect the downstream effects of that on our culture and society. That's what we're referring to. It's the variability. And to me, the issue is where I started this discussion, and that is the rate of change. It makes our knowledge systems less valuable. Our place-based knowledge becomes less valuable because we don't know how to respond appropriately to storms and changing droughts and floods and things like that, the rapidity and the severity of them.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. And you, Trevor, how would you sort of define climate change? I mean, because we're talking about, as Tom say, a very large and vast organism, the globe, and so it means more than just is it raining or shining the sun?
Climate change has an interesting history in some sense as emergence of a term, because when I was growing up, it was called global warming, and that was the term that dominated the 90s. And that, as I understood global warming, that just referred to the fact that the average global temperature was steadily increasing, not exactly year to year, but if you look at it over, a long, 50-year chunk, there is an almost perfect, slope upward, with a very gradual rate each year, but over a long period of time, adding up to something like half a degree Celsius. But that that term fell by the wayside because what was involved with this average rise in global temperature was a lot more complex, and Tom's alluded to some of those complexities. As I understand what climate change refers to, it refers broadly to the cluster of environmental and climatological effects that are brought about by this general increase in global temperature as created by the emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. And so in certain areas of the world, they're actually, the average temperature of certain local regions is actually decreased instead of increased. So this is one reason why global warming isn't really an accurate term, is because there are certain areas of the globe that actually haven't seen a temperature increase. That's just a measure of the average global temperature. But if you use the term climate change, that better captures what's really going on, because what you're seeing is ecosystems and climate patterns in various regions, the migration patterns of different species, and other things such as the rise in sea level. Those things are taking place on a global scale, and I think that and also that is another important thing. I mean, that was one thing that the global warming term got right that isn't as obvious from climate change, is global warming refers to a global phenomenon. Climate change does too, but it's not obviously built into the term. So I guess if I was going to give a really succinct definition, climate change equals the cluster of environmental and climate-related effects on the entire globe as a result of the emission of the rising temperatures brought about by the emission of greenhouse gases. Be something like that.
Yes. Trevor, and also, well, I would like to think that, and some groups do think this, that one significant way of participating in some type of change that the individual human can do is to be sustainable. And we have this term, sustainability, which is being used by everybody. It's being used by the most unsustainable groups also, many of our corporations. But perhaps how can one actually end up having a bit of ownership for the sustainable life? In my knowledge, certainly not eating. One thing that we do have in common, and Wendell Berry says it very well, Wendell Berry says eating is a political act, is an agricultural act. And so the whole idea of what we purchase as far as our food supply, which is a major cog in the system of staying alive. I believe both Tom and you think that. But so somehow purchasing in a sustainable manner, in other words, purchasing locally and purchasing with sort of an ethical basis of, farm to table. I'm not sure what my question is, but take it from there, you experts.
Huh. I take the general question to be... Oh, sorry, Tom. Did you want to interject?
Well, I was just going to try to answer the question, but you can go ahead. I'll follow you.
Okay. So I take the general question to be something along the lines of, how can I as an individual make a contribution to, our long-term human project of living on Earth in a sustainable way? What can I do? The first thing that occurs to me actually would be, frankly, to educate yourself about the impacts of your decisions, specifically the environmental impacts of your decisions. A lot of us, almost everything we do, almost every action we take has some kind of environmental impact, even things as seemingly innocuous as choosing to, drive to the post office one day, or decisions about what kinds of clothes we buy, where the fabric was produced, say, can make a big difference in what the environmental impact of producing that piece of clothing was. And there's an extent to which you can just get overwhelmed by looking at the different, the environmental impacts of your actions. But I think that making an effort to take those things into account is certainly one of the first steps in trying to really understand what it would mean for us as a society to live in a sustainable way. As far as more concrete things that you can do, things that might actually, play a role in how you structure your life, making efforts to reduce the amount of waste you produce, trying to recycle more or reuse things more, or frankly just not buying as much stuff. We live in a stuff-obsessed culture where material possessions are what a lot of people really want, and in a lot of cases that just contributes to the overconsumption problem that we have. It's at least quite prevalent in the United States. And I would say that just trying not to purchase as much stuff or have have as many things can go a fairly long way, because a lot of the stuff that we buy is not easily reusable or recyclable. This is especially true in the case of electronics.
Yes,
There are also, you've already highlighted one example, Daria, which was try to have less of an impact on the environment with respect to what you eat. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to become a vegetarian or a vegan. Just making maybe that's like a long-term goal that a person could work toward, but just making an effort, for instance, to purchase local, non-industrialized meat makes a huge environmental difference, at least with respect to the type of agricultural practice that you yourself are promoting and endorsing through your actions. Now, if we were to, ask like, well, does my not purchasing this particular, piece of turkey or pound of hamburger, does that really, make some kind of a difference economically in how much is produced? That would depend on a very long causal history of where that stuff comes from and how the market factors work. It's not obvious that it makes a difference in that sense, but it may make a difference. It certainly should make a difference, I think, in how you structure your life, and depending on, whether or not others observe your behavior or how it structures your other environmental commitments, it could make some kind of a tangible difference in those respects. But of course, your question wasn't so much about making a difference. It was more like, how can I sort of do my part with respect to being sustainable? And in that respect, I think clearly choices about what we eat are really, really relevant. There are also some interesting,
I think also, Trevor, if I might break in, I think also that perhaps it's an interesting time that we are alive right now, because it is asking each one of us to rise to a different level of thought, is it not? It is asking each one of us to sort of have some type of moral compass, to exercise those ideas, those, benign ethical ideas that we all harbor, but we don't practice. So I remember you talking about sort of weighing the difference between, eating a turkey sandwich and the real pathos and destruction of these, other species. And so it is, and that goes, it's not just the animals, but it's the world itself, and it's our future generations of humans also that we're kind of having to think about. And so it really is an opportunity for man, is it not? Man and woman.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree. This is a point that certain the environmental philosopher that I think has stressed this point the most is probably, at least to my knowledge, probably Dale Jamieson. He's emphasized in a lot of his work that the new, he said this especially with respect to climate change, that the new sort of global and intergenerational dimensions of what we can do to future people and to the environment more broadly forces us in many respects to re-examine how we approach these issues ethically, and that we actually need to sort of reorient our value systems and he also thinks potentially our political institutions and the basic structure of society to accommodate these new moral considerations that are new relative to the past, where, as I mentioned earlier, everything prior to basically mid-20th century, vast majority of moral philosophy was just focused on interactions between presently existing human beings. And there are also issues here with respect to some of these global environmental problems, because you no longer have easily traceable causes for the bad things that happen. So there is no one person who is responsible for climate change, and there is not even one nation that is responsible for climate change, because any individual emissions from any person or even any nation, even aggregated historically, would not cause the climate change problem. It's all of these things done, it's all of these different actions aggregated together to produce this really, really bad consequence. but that results in, there's this really, really bad thing that happens that seemingly no individual entity is responsible for. That's a relatively new sort of ethical problem that we haven't really faced too often before, and what we do in response is really, really hard to determine. Now, is this best seen as, an opportunity for, collective humanity to grow and develop, morally speaking? It could be. That's certainly a possibility. That's a very optimistic way to look at it. It's also an opportunity for us to gratuitously fail and potentially destroy the planet. So in his book, A Perfect Moral Storm, Steve Gardner, this is actually in one of his essays, which he calls "Our Uncreated," sort of pointedly, "Are we the scum of the earth?" He actually refers to this kind of general idea as humanity's challenge. That this is just, this is kind of what we face in the 21st century. This is the main big ethical problem that we have: is can we adapt in ways that will solve the problem of climate change? And this is, of course, tied up with tons of other environmental problems. We've gestured at a couple of them: animal farming and overpopulation, species extinctions, and so on. But the general idea being, can we, now that we've sort of come to understand these problems, can we adapt our moral values and our institutions and so on in ways that are appropriate to addressing these problems before the problems become so big and so cataclysmic that we're all screwed?
Well,
I hope so.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so too. Just a couple of quick points, 2 or 3 quick points. You've made some of them for me, but I think that there are 2 things that have to happen simultaneously for sustainability to make that real. One is that sustainability has to be a moral issue. I mean, it can't be just for the reasons that you point out, Trevor, that otherwise the economists use the term free rider. I mean, people know that even if they don't do anything and everybody else does, they're okay. And if they do things and nobody else does, they have accomplished nothing. So it has to become a moral issue. And then why recycle? Why save? And so on. Well, one person can't do it all, but you set an example. You create a wave of behavioral change by your setting an example. So I think that is hopeful if we can achieve that. Another point I wanted to make is that there are some things that are obviously sustainable that we can do. We can save. We can reduce our waste streams. We can use our waste streams. But on the other hand, a lot of things that seem obvious are not necessarily true. The local foods issue is one of those. It isn't simple that local foods saves energy or reduces the carbon footprint. It depends on how it is organized. Certain renewable energies may very well create more greenhouse gases depending on how they're produced, how they are set up, how they are dismantled when their useful life comes about. So we need to provide people with better information on the consequences. We need life cycle analysis of the carbon consequences, the energy consequences of certain behaviors. And it may be that certain recycling habits, for instance, actually take more energy than not because of the way we're recycling. Driving a long ways with a small amount of recycling in the back of our car to put it in a recycling bin, we may have burned up more fuel to get there than we would have in some other way of recycling. So there's an important need for information, life cycle consequences of our behavior so that people can make better behavior. You couple that with this moral compass that Daria was talking about, and the demonstration effect that leads other people to follow suit, and maybe we have a shot.
But Tom, usually when you're, when you're citing moral reasons and moral actions, if you don't have the laws that are going to enforce some type of behavior, morality tends to wither when it is confronted with self-need.
Well, I would differ. I believe that laws will only go so far, and I mean, if people don't voluntarily do what's right, laws are going to be far less effective. I think there's lots of empirical evidence for this, and Trevor, you may be able to cite some philosophy literature on this, but I think it is a truism that people need to want to do these things as well as they need to be forced to do these things.
Okay, Trevor.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly what the best way to motivate people to engage in these actions is. I wouldn't say that morality necessarily withers in the absence of a legal enforcement mechanism, because there are other things that can be equally effective. There are all kinds of things that we do that we're not legally required to do, but that we feel socially compelled to do for various reasons, because of established social conventions or social norms. So there's a lot of reason to think that if we were to instantiate living in more environmentally friendly ways, even if there weren't serious legal consequences for doing so, if it was a social norm to do so, a lot of people would abide by that because there would be significant social consequences from their failure to do so. So there are other ways to incentivize people in that respect without. Now, of course, there's the issue of establishing that social culture, which is its own obstacle.
But Trevor,
as far as people, needing to sort of want to bring about these environmental changes, I do think that the vast majority of people in the world have a broad commitment to trying to do the right thing. Yeah. I don't think there are very many people who are just genuinely evil. So I think that a really, really big step in the process is just getting them to understand what this baseline commitment to doing the right thing really involves, and getting them to recognize that it does involve certain environmental obligations. And I think that if you can get people that far, then there's hope that they'll simply take it from there, so to speak.
But Trevor, I've never really considered the individual human to be evil or against sort of a general moral code. But certainly the corporations are, because their sole existence is based on profit, on growth, etc. So their directive is so much different than the individual. And we seem to be skewing ever more towards giving corporations this abundance of power and space within our minds and our budgets, etc.
Well, so that might be a reason why, with respect to corporations, maybe some sort of legal enforcement mechanism is more appropriate.
Yeah, and I agree. I would agree. I think that you can't rely on human characteristics like morality and so on when it comes to an institution. And it isn't just corporations. It's any institution that...
It's morals and economy together.
Well, yeah, and I mean, we can argue that it's individuals have a responsibility to enforce either with regulation or through market discipline or through investment discipline, their morals, and through the governance of these institutions. It's the individual's responsibility to make the institutions behave in a moral fashion, and you can't expect the institutions themselves to do that because they're not human.
It's a terribly interesting conversation. I guess we're going to have to sort of sum up a little bit. This will be going on to probably a 2-hour program. I'd like for each one of you, Trevor Hedberg and Tom Johnson, to make some concluding remarks and perhaps to let our listening audiences here in Columbia, Missouri, perhaps tinker around with a different idea or sum up what you would like them to be hearing while we're discussing this, this very large and intricate problem of climate change and all of the variety of problems that we're dragging with us. It seems that during the 1800s and then up, we were always in this position of manifest destiny. Now it seems like the tide has changed.
Well, I guess to summarize, I would argue that we need a lot more frank discussion about the issues. We need a lot more information. As I indicated, we need to help people understand the consequences of their decisions. And it needs to be evidence-based, not conjecture, not anecdotal. We need solid evidence about the consequences of our behavior so that people can make the better choices. And then we need to we need to get together at a global level. There's no option but to take a global perspective on a global issue.
Yes, and Mr. Trevor Hedberg.
Right. So for our listening audience, I suppose you're coming at this climate change issue. I suppose there are basically two general recommendations that I would make for kind of developing a greater familiarity and understanding with the issue. There's no possible way that even listening to this entire program that I think a viewer approaching the issue from a serious point of view for the first time could really make a definitive judgment about what kind of impact it should have on how that person lives his or her life. So my first recommendation would be, if you're unclear about like the facts about climate change, get online and access the summary for policymakers that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, I believe the website is ipcc.gov, has recently put together. Their fifth assessment report has just come out. That is worth looking at just to get, I mean, the whole report is 500-some pages, but for just the physical science facts. But you don't need to read that. Just read the summary for policymakers. It gives a really good overview of just the really serious bad effects that seem like they should be taken into consideration by people who are trying to put together a global solution to the problem. Because the first step in really understanding climate change is understanding just how bad the impacts are. And though Tom and I have gestured at a lot of these impacts very briefly in conversation, seeing some of the actual scientific evidence and understanding the details, I think, is really important. If you're trying to get a more, trying to understand the issue in a more ethical way, there are two particular books that I can highly recommend. One is by John Broome. For some reason, the title is losing me, so I'll give the Gardner book first. Stephen Gardner's A Perfect Moral Storm is probably the most comprehensive text on the climate change issue. It's pretty long, but it has a lot of good stuff in it, and it is worth the read if you have the time. And even if you don't, it's split up into accessible chapters. There's one on cost-benefit analysis, one on sort of these each different dimension of the climate change problem that he thinks is really important. One on like the intergenerational dimension, one on the theoretical dimension, and one on the global dimension. And the title of the book, Perfect Moral Storm, is because that's what he thinks climate change is. He thinks that it's the moral problem that's put us in a perfect position to fail to meet our ethical obligations. The John Broome book, titles come back to me.
Counting the cost?
What?
Counting the cost of global warming?
No, Broome's book is called Climate Matters, Ethics in a Warming World.
Okay.
And Broome's book is shorter. It's what I would use if I was teaching an undergraduate environmental ethics course and wanted to do climate change. It's like a 200-page book. He has a chapter on the science, chapter on the economics. He's got a bunch of. He also considers the issue from both the standpoint of what we should do at the institutional level and what we should do at the individual level. So what should individuals do with respect to trying to reduce their carbon footprint? So first broad suggestion, just try to learn more about the issue, and then hopefully, you can come. I mean, I sort of believe that everybody's philosophical investigation is their own, and that it's better to try to work these issues out for yourself than to just be told by an instructor of philosophy or a professor of philosophy or even the author of a book exactly what to believe. I think that you got to wrestle with these issues for yourself and figure it out on your own. But the second thing, frankly, is I think that whatever you ultimately decide you ought to do with respect in light of these environmental problems, the key is actually making an effort to integrate your environmental commitments into your life in some kind of tangible and concrete way. There are too many folks that if we were to survey them, if we were to give them polls or ask them their opinion, they would espouse a commitment to doing to bettering the environment and to supporting, environmentally beneficial policies and so on. But when you look at the way that they live their life, there's nothing that evidences that belief. They don't seem to actually do anything or take any actions that would disrupt the, what we might call business as usual way of doing things, which is incredibly environmentally destructive. So in really broad terms, learn more about the issue and make up your mind about it, and then integrate what you believe about it into your life in some kind of concrete and tangible way.
Yes, I think that is excellent information by both of you. You're both saying gather a bit of information so you can make some type of an informed plan of action in order to integrate some type of sustainability into your own life. I'd like to say thank you very much to Professor Tom Johnson here at the University of Missouri, and also to Professor Trevor Hedberg, who is from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Thank you so much for coming on to the program and talking to our listeners here at KOPN Columbia. And I think that this is something that warrants more information, more delving. And so hopefully the listeners have learned something. I certainly have. Trevor, thank you so much for being available for this lengthy discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me on board, Daria. I am not a professor yet, but I'll take that as a compliment nevertheless.
Oh yes.
And still got a ways to go before we make that jump, but
right.
I'm hopeful that I'll get there. And Tom, thank you for a spirited discussion and for sharing your economic expertise. I very much think that climate change is an interdisciplinary issue, that we need as many smart people from as many different disciplines working on it at the same time, especially given the gravity of the problem. And so it was nice to talk with someone who seems to be doing that.
I agree completely, Trevor.
Okay, we will end here then, and thank you so much. Okay, Trevor and Tom, did you want to speak a little bit that isn't going to be on the air? You're welcome to. Trevor?
I don't know if I have a ton to add. I feel in a way a bit talked out. I worry, if anything, I may have said too much.
No. Listen, Trevor, thanks so much, and I'll be in touch, and like in the past, I'll be sending you a CD, okay?
Yeah, no problem. Oh, do you know when this would be? I mean, I'm sure you'll let me know, but I'm just curious from time estimate. Do you know when this might be on the air?
It'll either be on the air in either in April or in May, and it would be but then I'll be putting it on several times so that we have different listening audiences that get to benefit from hearing it. But this will be it'll be a 2-hour slot, actually, that I'm going to be doing it. So it will be on a Tuesday afternoon. But I will.
Okay. Well, I hope that it was. I hope it was quality.
Oh, yeah. Well, anything you and Tom are doing is quality. So I think we've talked over the heads of many people, but then also directly to a great deal of the population that listens to this type of thing. Don't you, Tom?
I think so.
It's hard to have sustained discussion of an issue as complex as climate change without unless we were to take an hour of conversation and just lay out. Here's climate science in a nutshell. Here's the basics of the political situation with respect to climate change. Here's some of the recent ethical concerns that have come to the fore. Unless we were going to take an hour and do that, almost impossible to discuss this stuff without going over some people's heads if they're approaching the issue for genuinely in a reflective, critical way, genuinely for the first time.
Well, my philosophy is you always should, with your students, give them some ideas that challenge them. Every time you talk to them, give them a term they haven't heard of before. So, well, it was a pleasure, Trevor.
I agree with that as well.
I look forward to keeping in touch with your work in the future. Okay.
Yeah, it's good talking to you, Tom, and. Have a good rest of the day, and I'll look forward to listening to the interview when it makes it on the air.
Okay, and listen, Trevor. Next time you visit your parents in Kansas, come through Columbia, and we'll have dinner with Tom, and you'll get to actually meet Tom in person. Okay.
Well, I usually fly back, so.
Oh, you do? Okay. Oh, well,
yeah,
that's a pretty heavy carbon imprint. No, I'm only kidding you. No, but anyway.
No, that's true. This is what I'm talking about, right?
I was thinking perhaps you were talking about that, but anyway, we'll meet someday. I hope, Trevor. Okay, I'm a great fan of yours.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, it's even worse. I'm going to be going to Colorado in the summer to present a paper on the ethics of geoengineering, and I will probably be flying to Colorado to do that. So there's direct.
It all depends, in my view, Trevor. It depends on how much good you do when you get there. This is the life cycle as philosophy. If you change a dozen people's minds and they all do a little bit, then that trip was worth it. Especially given the fact that you're dividing that trip with everybody else in the plane. So.
Yeah, and there's also, if we're just speaking in make a difference terms, that plane's going to fly whether I'm on it or not. There will be someone to fill that seat, if I'm not there.
Yeah.
But this is also some of the reason. But at the same time, I worry this, this make a difference kind of stuff, if you run it too much,